The Shining. Plunked somewhere between middling operation and magnum opus, hilarity and horror, pop classic and epochal counterculture, sits The Shining. You, gentle viewer, have seen it. And that says plenty right there. Panned upon release, dismissed in much of the critical literature on its revered author, and even shunned by some contemporary popular audiences as overlong and unscary, the movie nonetheless provides a paradigmatic study of how the canon is formed. Not by critics and academics, but by the legions of movie fans who actually geek around and watch this stuff. If today we are dealing with the prospect of a popular Oscar, favored by even the high-minded president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, John Bailey himself, then it's largely because of the blurring of art, literary world, and popular tastes that movies like The Shining have facilitated. Today, the casual observer is as likely to go strolling down a hallway at the Overlook Hotel while at the Museum of Modern Art as they are at a Halloween house party. For one amongst the generations of dire acolytes who have inflicted obsessively attenuated multiple viewings of Stanley Kubrick movies upon their lives, the thing about them that emerges as the most shocking is that despite their iconic differences in look, his use of camera movement, lighting, and framing are nearly identical, especially in the later work. Characters are usually framed center with wide lenses that keep all the space in sharp focus. Lighting is almost always motivated, low-key, typically with sources in the frame, like a lamp behind somebody. And that zoom is ready to either creep in on somebody or just pounce. That zoom is always there as a resource. So it's amazing that the basics of what he did with Barry Lyndon here in The Shining produce palpable dread rather than mere unease in that other film. The lighting in The Shining, as one note though, stands out for they were letting daylight go blue in that movie. Altman had done this with McCabe and Mrs. Miller in '71. Got this richly atmospheric effect, a kind of romantic look for a really unromantic film, but it's done to different effect here. Kubrick and company go for a spectral and menacing feel. There may be movies out there with more written about them, but there are probably few with more contrived nonsense, grasping at the most minor details for preposterously in-depth interpretations based on fleeting glimpses of tobacco cans, ski posters, and children's toys. Surely some of these interpreters have discovered Alex Jones with great approval. The reason so many have projected their particular concerns onto the movie with relative success is because in its distilled simplicity, stark and by turns blank and grimaced, it leaves room to hang stuff up. My own interpretation doesn't go much farther than the hotel found another willing victim in Jack, but couldn't account for Danny, so it lost this round, and it works just fine like that. Lastly, I do, however, agree entirely with the most incredible of Shining analysts, the internet's anonymous self-proclaimed mastermind, in that it is an inordinately accomplished tapestry of moving pictures with sound. And that, while it may not be the greatest ever, like Mastermind asserts, I will concede this, it's probably not Kubrick's best film, but it may be his only perfect film.
So that's our guest. Hello, thank you for joining us on Vermont Film Essentials. This is a very special episode because it deals with a very special movie to all of us, I believe, and that is Stanley Kubrick's seminal version of Stephen King's novel, The Shining. And my name is David Metzger.
I'm Devon Ewalt.
Alex Lavin, pleased to be joining you.
Good to
Thank you very much for joining us. So one of the things that you touched on at first was that how this film, and this is what I remember when I was a kid, was that it wasn't a movie that cinephiles or even critics were going to point you to. Like I remember we talk about Leonard Maltin's book. I think it's a 2-star, again, a 2-star review.
Another one of those that he just had his own personal grudge against for various reasons. Taxi Driver, there's a handful of them.
Really?
Yeah.
And even I remember like when Eyes Wide Shut came out and Stanley Kubrick passed away, Entertainment Weekly did this whole big tribute to Kubrick, and they listed all of his films, and they had the critics at Entertainment Weekly, Owen Gleiberman I think was one of them, give them like reviews like they usually do. And this was the one film that did not get most of them were like hanging around A+, B+, and this one was at a C. And I was like, wow. And then all of a sudden that seemed to shift. People tended to look at it again, revisit it, and now I think while it's not hailed as one of his best, because that's quite a list that he's got there, Mr. Kubrick. But I think it's it's certainly the film that I was drawn to first as a kid.
I think you're not alone, right?
Yeah.
Do you guys remember when you first saw The Shining?
So it's really interesting. We had talked a little bit about like the first DVDs we ever bought or whatever, and I definitely grew up on video, but getting your first DVD when I was like 17 was like a big deal, like and I remember the first one I got was Batman and the second one I got was The Shining. And so when you only own a few movies, you watch them a lot, so
I'd say,
I was revisiting The Shining a lot, and it really became like that, and I loved the book. It's my favorite Stephen King book, so for that, it had a personal connection, even though he did his own thing with it, which I was just fine with. I'm open to interpretation. I'm open to the idea of reinterpretation, reimagining.
You're probably the only one in that case, though. You're probably not the only one who discovered their first Stanley Kubrick film as was The Shining, but you're probably the only one who said, "Yeah, you know what? They're both good. I'm not going to pick sides here," because everybody was partisan about that.
I don't need them to be reflections of each other.
Did you guys see it too young, or were you? Some people see it when they're like 6 years old, and they have, nightmares.
Right. That was
like a major
for me.
problem.
I saw it when I was like 9, but like, how old were you?
I think I had to have been probably around 12 or 13. So I wasn't. It was still young.
Still young,
but it
for
wasn't.
That kind of.
It didn't scare the crap out of me. But it certainly unnerved me. There were images that unnerved me, and it always became one of those things. Like I remember thinking that. And I hate even saying this right now, but I remember thinking that I don't like Shelley Duvall's performance in it when I first saw it as a kid. But then, getting into college, it's like, oh no, she's it is pretty amazing the lengths that she is given and the way that she displays just how unnerved and how terrified she is.
I feel like it's misunderstood in the same sense we talked about Shelley Winters in Night of the Hunter and certain things. I think sometimes a certain approach is just like, well, that's not the way I would be. Or I feel like sometimes people they expect a certain type of performance. Well, so they're not prepared to get what they're getting.
Those are two huge performances by Jack Nicholson and Robert Mitchum, respectively. And there's this whole thing where if something is big and bold in a movie, but it's not hanging in balance with other aspects, it's kind of out of place. But if you have a lot of really strong performances like Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall in The Shining, that kind of restores some balance that wouldn't be there otherwise. So she has to go into, they talk about how he puts on the kabuki mask. Well, so does she.
In her first scene, it's kind of a running joke with my wife Robin and I, because every time we watch it, there's a scene at the beginning where she smokes a cigarette. And she's just like, look at the way she's holding her cigarette. It's so, she's so wooden. And I'm like, yeah, but I think it's because, what if you were married to Jack Torrance and he's already becoming unhinged before the movie starts. For her, she's like, I don't know what he's going to do. I think I might be married to an abusive husband and an abusive father, but I'm not sure.
Her discomfort in that scene is reflective of her entire state. I feel like it is a nice setup for what is to come.
I'm glad she came up, and I didn't think that she would come up this early in the discussion. But I gotta tip the hat to old Shelley Duvall, because she really is a phenomenally talented actor.
Altman didn't work with Sanchez.
There were a series of female actors in the 1970s that really kind of redefined what women's roles could be like Sissy Spacek and Shelley Duvall. And the interesting thing about Shelley Duvall, one of them anyway, was that she really carried strong baggage from role to role, where she was this kind of ingenue in 1975's Nashville for Robert Altman, and again for Robert Altman in 77. Maybe that ingenue it's getting a little bit worn out with this next character, where she's getting a little too old to be this daft, frankly. And then by the time we get to 1980 and with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, 75, 77, 80, she's really kind of brought this baggage to the point where people think that her performing as this character is what Shelley Duvall is really like.
Right. Well, and I read some reviews comparing her performance to Olive Oil, and it was like, I feel like that's so unfair. I feel like it's like she really is in the circumstances that
Of course,
of
who
The Shining.
could forget Olive Oil? Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And it's just like
another great performance, frankly.
Right, but when someone does something iconic like that, people want to take it and connect the thread to the next thing, and I feel like she's doing her own thing here.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely. And do you guys think that Stanley Kubrick's probably as big a jerk on this set as they said that he was?
I think so.
The footage that I've seen doesn't help him. It's pretty.
He knew there was a hot mic, right? I mean, it was his own daughter doing the footage.
Right.
So.
And I don't know, and it's one of those things because, I'm always one that's like, I hold him up as, cinematic, director god, like we all do. But there's certain moments where I'm like, was that really necessary? But then I see the result. And I'm like, I don't know. It's that tricky line where it's like, him getting her, him breaking her down to the point where she just doesn't know what to do and doesn't even know what side is up anymore.
Yeah, and the performance
completely
becomes visceral.
in the performance.
Yeah, and so I think we all can concede, especially in this time, in this day and age, where we're basically having this big reckoning, where it's like, wow, what does it mean to go and do a job? If Shelley Duvall went to her job, got mentally broken down by Stanley Kubrick in order to do this performance, and basically had to restore herself after this job, I'm not sure it was the most fair job. Although she is on record saying, I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Exactly.
Right.
Nick,
I'm not here to judge.
I was reading about Nicholson becoming so frustrated with the constant script changes that he literally would just crumple up one that they gave him, and then because he knew it would be changed by the end of the day, and then he was learning most of his scenes minutes before doing them.
So
which
it's
is just
not a
another-
bad thing that I took forever until the last minute writing the piece for this show. Oh, great.
And the footage from that making of documentary that we're referring to, there's sides of it where Jack Nicholson in an interview after the fact is saying he was a completely different director with Shelley than he was with me, and sometimes I would feel bad about that, but I would just show up and do the work. And he mentioned the fact that he was frustrated with the script changes, but then at a certain point he just had to let it go.
Right.
And one of my favorite Jack moments in that documentary is, I think it might even be Stanley Kubrick's daughter, who made the documentary, comes up to him and is like, do you want to read lines? And he's just like, I would love to read lines with you. Because he's just Jack, but he's also in character, and it shows him pumping himself up. And
I was
doing,
just thinking of that moment when before the scene.
acts.
Yeah. It's really cool to watch that stuff.
Right.
It just occurred to me, it's nice to be able to have something, it's like, we're going to talk about The Shining. It's like, oh my God, there's already so much out there, but most of it is such BS. And then the stuff that is worth saying, a lot of it has been said. I think that there was probably something really exciting about the year 1980. I know it was an exciting time in terms of music in American culture, and also to a certain extent, European transatlantic culture, whatever, because he was over there in England. But it was probably a pretty exciting time in movies because Exorcist, Jaws, Star Wars had happened.
Yep.
There was now a redefined market where you had to have a newly marketable film. And it wasn't 1974 Chinatown. It wasn't the era of the realistic Alan J. Pakula and William Friedkin and Robert Altman films of the 1970s that very much marketed themselves on realism. There was a new thing where you had to be a little bit more than real. You know, I don't think the term high concept had been invented yet, but it's certainly describing the films from around that time that really turned up that marketability aspect. And that has certain consequences for performance as well. We're going from very realistic performances to slightly less realistic performances embedded with realistic performances in something like Star Wars, where you have people, you know, being snarky and normal to each other right next to very solemn, you know, like monologues and things like that, and they're negotiating what a new performance style might look like. Jack had already done a few really realistic performance styles in things like Chinatown, The Passenger, and we all know
the Rafelson stuff. I mean, all that stuff. You
absolutely.
know? Yeah.
We all know that he wasn't comfortable going where he went in this movie, and yet it was a frontier at the time. And so I think it's nice to be able to pay tribute to the fact that a group of artists were out on this frontier, basically like, how weird and grimaced and kind of shrieking can we make this thing and still make it halfway intelligible, you know?
And he has said that, you know, while we just said that, you know, it might not be his very best, but it's certainly his most accessible and his most commercial. And it seems like he was really after that. You know, he's just coming after Barry Lyndon, which, you know, was, in his mind, a failure commercially at the box office, and critically it was kind of a mixed bag. And he has said that he looked back at, like, you know, William Friedkin did The Exorcist, Nicholas Roeg did Don't Look Now, Alfred Hitchcock did Psycho. It's like these masters are doing their version of a horror movie, and I don't like the fact that, you know, they're getting their shine. I hate that I just said that on that. But, you know, he really looked at this as like, you know, I want to do my horror movie. I want to do my commercial. And you look at this and you're like, you know, all the pieces are there, but because he's Stanley Kubrick, he can't help but make it the high art that it is.
For some reason, he makes me think of like James Joyce. It's like you ask James Joyce to tell the story of Ulysses, you're going to get that novel. And it's a similar thing to me, where it's like he's so smart that he literally reads everything there is to read about his topic. Like, he's that guy.
He sent a research team to Colorado to look up the history of the westward expansion in Colorado. So for those of us who would like to be a little bit dismissive about the whole detected theme of the Native American genocide that runs throughout the picture, and so, some of us on one side of the coin would just say it's a bunch of tapestries that happen to appear behind Jack at pivotal times, and it's just a rug. It just happens to be the rug in a pivotal scene. But at the same time, why did he send those people to do all that research if he wasn't going to reference it?
Exactly.
And I do think it's because this might be the disagreement between Stephen King and Kubrick, is because Kubrick had to have, no matter how spectral or supernatural he would go with a horror movie, he always needed to have a basis of reality in which to draw upon it. Stephen King would just be like, well, you know, no, the animal things just come alive, and that's, you don't have to explain it, don't explain it. But he has to be like, no, I need to explain it. I need to understand why these hauntings are happening.
Horror.
And if he goes back to the history of where, you know,
there's a quote where King describes Kubrick as thinking too much and not feeling enough, but then a film critic went back on him saying, well, I think actually Stephen King feels too much and doesn't think enough. So it's almost like you can find this movie somewhere within that paradox, you know?
Well, I think for Stephen King, and I haven't read The Shining since I was in high school, so I can't comment on that. I fairly recently listened to the book on tape of The Stand in its unabridged form, and for Stephen King, I very much feel like evil has a character. Evil has a smell for Stephen King. It's real, and it has a backstory. And that's part of what makes it so evil, is it's actually embodied in some sense. Kubrick doesn't really care about where evil comes from or where it goes. It's simply there, and leaving the guesswork to you is how much of this is Jack and how much of this is Hotel. Like, that's the whole movie, is the fun of that.
Yes.
And by over literalizing this force of evil, it's doing a disservice to all the fun we're having, trying to unpack where Jack ends and the hotel begins.
You know, there's two moments that one I noticed for the first time, but then the other I just really kind of saw for the first time for what it was when Wendy and Danny are in the maze, and when Jack looks down at the model of the maze, and the way it looks is he is in charge of this world. Basically, he is the caretaker of their world, and they are just players. I mean, it's just such a brilliant way to establish that. And then the other was just when Wendy is walking by in front of the mirror, she does it 3 times. Her reflection doesn't show up. The first time I look, I'm like, wait a minute, is she not showing up in that mirror? Happens again, she walks right in front of the mirror, no reflection.
Wow.
It's very odd. I have never noticed it. And I was like, what does that mean? And it's like one of those things that's just like unexplained, and there's so many of them.
There are so many. Have you guys seen Room 237, the documentary?
Yes, I love it just because I love kind of it, and like...
Most of it is like, it's like the Pink Floyd Wizard of Oz thing. It's
Right,
like,
right.
How many drugs do you have to take to find this stuff? But so a lot of it is like that. I do think that the Native American plight does have. I do think it's there. I don't think he. I think it's like how you say, like he just leaves these little kind of breadcrumbs, and it's like if you want to follow them, they're there. If not, then whatever. The moon landing stuff, I lost me there. But then there's also like really fun stuff, like the whole concept of where the rooms are and how they're not geographically accurate.
Yeah, there's a window in what's his name's office that shouldn't be there.
Shouldn't be
unless there's a courtyard. Nobody really asks that question. I'm just saying, it's a fancy hotel. There could be a courtyard. Wouldn't be unprecedented.
Right.
But there's plenty of weird stuff. There's disappearing chairs and typewriters that change color, and he's reading a Playgirl in the waiting room. Not that but like just all these
I did not notice.
innocuous seeming details that when you really pull them apart, it doesn't make sense. And of course, he said in many interviews, especially around the time of 2001, Clockwork Orange, this is meant to, my movie should be doing to you essentially what they're doing to Alex when he's sitting in the chair. Like, he knows what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And they were also talking about that during The Shining, he specifically was going through a book about advertising secrets and subliminal manipulation via advertising. So I'm not here to tell you what Stanley Kubrick meant to do, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't add up.
Right.
Well, and I think it's when people say, oh, well, if the fact that it's built on Native American burial ground, if that's part of it, then then it has to be the whole thing. It's like, why can't he just kind of embed little things like, well, this is part of our history, and so I'm going to put it in here, and then that'll be part of it. Mm-hmm. And it's like a collage, and it like can become its own thing. It doesn't have to be one centralized purpose where those could just be little. Right. Just little details,
And he gives a line to the guy as he's taking them around. He says, this housed some elaborate guests and everything, and she's like royalty, and he's like, yeah, all the best people. And it's like, wow, you can read into that.
Yeah. Well, as a great little sort of era moment of basically saying, like, you're just a woman, you're not the person that I'm hiring to do this, you're basically freight, you're basically baggage, and I don't have to relate to you on the same level of humanity that I do Jack. Right. And so if you want to follow the thread of, yes, white Anglo-Saxon culture and its westward expansion had a certain racist, sexist angle to it, like that's definitely there in the movie. And whether or not it just needs to be there as an incidental aspect, or whether you want to start to extrapolate all this intentional stuff from it, that's up to you.
Right. But I think just from a technical point of view, the things that he did as a filmmaker, I mean, that opening shot, I mean, I
watched it earlier today.
It's crazy. Like, it's crazy how still it is. It's crazy how hypnotic it is. There's that. There's the fact that it's one of the first films to employ the Steadicam in a more detailed, not just for a scene. Like, he uses it as a character in the film.
Well, and the creator of it was heavily involved in it and like learned to perfect it, working on it. It's really cool.
He's just always on the cutting edge. Like, with Barry Lyndon, it's the candle thing, and with this, it's like, okay, we got this new device. How can I use it? How can I use it to tell my story in a very dynamic way? and he does that, like following Danny on that down that bike is just
the
insane.
sound of when he's on the carpet, when he's off the carpet. I mean, it's just brilliant.
And Kubrick saying, like, I didn't hear it that way until we listened back to it. And I'm like, wow, that's so cool. We got to enhance that. And have either of you seen it on the big screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have not.
So they showed it at Essex Cinemas. It was part of their Throwback Thursdays that they used to do, and it was a Halloween edition. They showed it, and what struck me I never realized just how emotionally potent and frightening Jack Nicholson really is until you see it on that big screen, because I do think he wanted to look at what an abusive family actually looks like, what an abusive husband and what an abusive father actually is, and really exploit it for how terrifying it can be. And there's certain moments in his performance where you're just like you're just stuck in this seat and you can't escape it.
I know I have plenty of moments in this movie that I almost feel like it would be criminal for me to not just bring them up and just do my little fanboy thing, but certainly the thing where you're just zooming in on Jack and the audience is actually compelled to do their own CGI, where you see him becoming a wolfman before your eyes. Nothing happens to him. There is no manipulation of the image whatsoever.
Is it when he's looking?
He just starts to look kind of wolfen, and the audience is thinking like,
and
is there some
slight
kind of
sneer that he does like quickly?
Is this Frederick March in 1931 with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? But there's nothing going on. It's just you doing it, and I'm a common thing where people are like, is something happening to him right now? But nothing's happening to him right now.
Yeah.
Definitely the thing where he's looking down at the maze that's where it first just starts to congeal for the audience that yes, this guy is really up to no good. It's not just like he woke up on the wrong side of the bed today. Mm-hmm. This guy is real trouble.
He's the Minotaur. Yeah, that's the thing. I feel like that's his moment of looking down at like, I am going to pursue them.
Right.
Well, it wasn't in the book, right? So what's the deal with the maze?
I know.
That one really screams out for people to, project way too much stuff on it.
Yeah.
But
it's true.
Let's just say if literary criticism has ever had fun making mud stick to a wall, it's by invoking the Greeks. So if we're going to reach for something, we might as well reach for the Minotaur and the maze. I saw it for the first time with a bunch of kids at a birthday party in South Hero. And we were all 10 years old or so. It was like 5th grade, and we all thought we were, real tough back then. But as soon as that first shot clicked in, we were all rapt and we were all terrorized from the very first note of that theme and from the first shot of that movie. And we were all trying to pretend like we weren't scared or anything like that. But by the end of that movie, we had lost our minds with terror, basically. And that's one of the most memorable first viewings, probably the most memorable first viewing of a Kubrick film.
There's just so many. One of the things I love is that it's a horror movie that has, nothing. There's no scenes that are at night. There's no darkness and shadows. Everything is so well lit and so ordinary, and all this unexplainable thing, all these unexplainable things, and all of these just weird moments that you can't explain. Like, what are those two kids?
Right.
When you first see them. Then there's the whole, the furry obviously giving fellatio to a guest, and you're just...
There's a whole
for the first time
video on that.
For the first time I thought of Inland Empire when I saw that. I was like, oh, I wonder if that was just a subconscious choice for Lynch of like thinking of that scene, just where he got an idea. Like, what if I did this with that idea?
I know that he co-wrote with Diane Johnson, who had a lot of left field kind of stuff that would manage to work its way in. So I wouldn't be shocked if that was a Diane Johnson basically being like, well, and I can hear Kubrick saying, how would this hotel show itself to people, or something like that. And then Diane Johnson's like, well, what about, some kind of bear suit giving head? I don't know.
Brilliant.
And it's great because it actually has a number of associations. The idea of, using somebody as a kind of sex slave. We have a lot of associations with the ruling class and their sexual exploitation of people. Mm-hmm. But then the thing that makes it doubly horrific is usually the ruling class and people in power want to take advantage of people who are sexually attractive. And then who we have getting sexually abused in the middle of the scene, but the least sexually attractive character that you see in the entire film. So again, on top of so many layers of horror, it's head spinning, and it's great that he doesn't tell you how to feel or how to react to it. You know, that's what had us bugging back then.
I mean, it is so bright, brightly lit, like you said, with all these colors, but I feel like there's something very like artificial feeling about it, in the sense that you can't quite get comfortable, and you can't help but feel like that it's claustrophobic.
Those bold primaries.
Even how big it is, it's claustrophobic, and it's like, and the way Jack's like, it's homey, and it's not homey, and it's like this overcompensation for the American public to just kind of like
people talk like they're in a TV ad. It's like, oh, that's great,
right. It's very stylized. It's very interesting.
And then we get, so room 237 is green, right? It's that lime green, and then the bathroom is the red. Those primary colors that just pop, and there is something that happens like psychologically with each color that happens to you when you're watching it. Like with the room 237 scene, it's one of those things where you want to look away, but you can't look away. And part of it is the music, part is the hypnotic, that steady shot that just stays there. Part of it is the beautiful thing that is coming out of the tub and walking towards you. But just the way it's even structured, where that happens and then what happens later and how that is revealed. It is absolute true horror. Like, you feel like this is not something that's been concocted or made up, but it's something that's actually happening in front of you.
And then he includes the little disjunction that I didn't actually, I had seen it, of course, because I've seen this movie. We've all seen this movie way too many times, right?
Yes.
The disjunction between him embracing the much older woman, or the ghost, or something, and then a shot to what you think initially is the same ghost rising naked from the tub, but then you see that she's got much shorter hair. So this disjunction of like, wait, now who do we got? Like, there are these things that very cannily kind of take you by surprise, and he compounds dread with unease, with horror, with all this stuff, and
the whole detailed writing of so blatantly they look like twins, and to have him say, well, one is 8, I think one's 8, one's 10, and it's like such a specific thing, and you're like, but they don't look like it, and it's just such a weird detail to seem arbitrary.
And yet, I think we've all seen films where people are clearly going for something cool and different. I think of Richard, what's his name? Kelly's Southland Tales, where he's really going for something amazing and different, but there's not enough kind of holding it all, this kind of centrifuge all together. And that's the nice thing about The Shining, is there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of nice stuff that you can stand on firmly. There's plenty to stand on. And then the other stuff that's weird, you kind of don't notice how weird it is until you've already had your fun with the movie. And then you can kind of pick it apart. But it's got enough of a foundation of narrative and enough of a payoff of that narrative. It's really quite a neatly constructed story that the rest of the stuff is really just not interference at all. It doesn't inhibit you from getting something out of the movie on a very plain Jane level.
Right. There's never moments where you feel like, oh, you're just being weird for the sake of being weird. And I'm not with this. Right. You definitely feel like you are being taken and into a story that is being told by a filmmaker that is completely unique.
I asked around in preparation for this episode because I appreciated so much being included. So I asked a young lady who's a big movie fan and stuff like that. I wouldn't say a big horror movie fan, but she said she's not even a horror movie fan. She's too scared of horror movies. But she says that she can watch this because it's not scary. So again, that's just a note from the public. And another one that I thought counted was this guy who was he's a real gorehound. He used to sell gray market tapes in the back of Fangoria. He's like, oh, The Shining, that was never really for us, meaning like the horror community. So it's this really interesting thing. It's like this popular appeal movie that's supposed to have some appeal for the horror fans, and it's also this real high art, like MoMA kind of thing. Like, you could hang some of these frames on your wall, and it kind of is in such a weird place and has endured there for so long that it's created its own new place. And you really could say that it has spawned a series of brethren like Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson that are really their horror movies that are working on a more of a fine art sort of level of operation.
Well, and I do, like, I think that of all the filmmakers that ape Kubrick or try to do something very Kubrick-like, I think Jonathan Glazer probably has the most success with that. I wasn't really a fan of The Witch, but I know that there are certain moments that are very reminiscent of The Shining.
I didn't know that. I'll have to go back and check now. Thank you.
Like the scene when he goes to the cave and then the woman comes out of the cave is pretty shot for shot the same as the tub. And then like I just watched Hereditary. I don't know if
I haven't seen
That's
it.
new.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's moments like people have compared it to Rosemary's Baby, similar to The Witch, and have compared it to what Kubrick did with The Shining. But there's like moments in there. It didn't overall it didn't really work for me. But there are moments in there where I'm like, well, like it's easier if I use the Rosemary's Baby reference, but it's like at the end of Rosemary's Baby, you don't see the baby.
Right.
This movie would have showed the baby.
Thank you. That's good.
See, I think that Kubrick has such a powerful ability to create atmosphere that there are moments that are just have a pervasive sense of just dread to them without him even needing to like do anything with the screenplay to make it so overtly. Like all the scenes with Lloyd, I mean, they're just unnerving. They get under my skin. It's just like, there's something about it. There's a knowing look in his eye. The scene with Grady in the bathroom, it's frightening.
Yeah.
And
You remember when we went to Burlington College, Dave? Sorry to unpack your history in front of everybody, but one of the things you had to do was a director's emulation. You would pretend and what director's emulation meant to most students who knew what they were doing was do something in the vein of Polanski, a la Hereditary. But I didn't do that. I recreated the bathroom scene between Grady and Jack, shot for shot, in the Hilton in Burlington. And because I was just like, why not just remake it shot for shot and cross the line like 50 times, the 180 axis like he does 50 times. And it didn't come out well, which is, again, you guys that want to rip off Kubrick and everything, you can try and rip off the spirit. You can try and be animated by the spirit of what he did. But if you try and rip him off, it's not going to work. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh my God, what else?
I love this movie, but I must say that I will concede that it's not as scary as other Kubrick movies were to me. Clockwork Orange was actually the scariest of Kubrick movies to me because that gets you really down to the core of what humanity's all about.
Moments of Full Metal Jacket for me.
Well, yeah,
the first part with D'Onofrio.
Yeah, him in the D'Onofrio in the bathroom stall. That will forever be one of the most horrific things that I that I accidentally watched at like age 9. But I would agree. I would agree with that. Like I don't think it's necessarily. I don't think it's poop your pants scary.
Yeah, well,
but I think it is. It unnerves you. Like that's the type of horror film that I actually appreciate the most. Are the ones that stick with you and the ones that make you just like, ugh, like.
It's sustained. It's entrancing.
Yeah.
It'll you'll turn it on by accident, and an hour will go by and you don't know what happened. Literally, you'll lose time with this movie.
Yes.
I mean, Polanski's Repulsion always comes to mind because it's like not maybe accepted as a legit horror film, but it is doing things to you when you're watching it.
That is a really good comparison.
Due to the filmmaking.
Sure.
know?
Even from that very first scene in the
performance,
beauty
too.
shop, there is a palpable sense of unease that follows this character around. She's haunted too, you might say.
There are moments with Jack Nicholson's performance where I feel like he has gone in another place, and I don't know, where you get the freedom to do the things that he does in this movie, and I think no matter how many people will chastise him for going way over the top or being kabuki, for me when I watch it, he gets away with it with me. Like I don't think it's that over the top within the construct of what the character that he has created.
You just made me realize something. I'm sorry. There were moments when I was trying to do the same, trying to gauge the same thing of like, is he too over the top here? He's looking at people out of the side of his eye like he can't trust if they're real or not, or if this is reality.
shit.
He's doing things where he's going like, when he's doing that stuff where he's like looking, he's doing this thing where I just realized it now. It's like, but he does it in such a, almost like his soul is, he's so dangerous of losing the tether that he's like swimming. And the reason it can be so big is because it's that big. It's literally, he's about to lose his humanity.
Yeah, and I mean, there's the sheer metrics of what you're dealing with, which is, you know, he had him do 50 or more takes, and he just kept pushing him and pushing him into these extremes, and invariably these were the takes that Kubrick selected. So I'm sure he tried to do some Antonioni takes, you know, where he's just like walking, you know, sleepwalking through the scene, and Kubrick wasn't trying to have that apparently.
Apparently, they almost didn't use the "Here's Johnny" scene because Kubrick wasn't really, he had been living in England and wasn't really aware of it as a cultural, aware of its cultural significance. So he almost used a different take. And then upon learning that, it's like,
I think that you could knock Kubrick for not keeping up with the times, especially in the United States, given how much things change in the 60s and then 70s and then 80s, and it's tough to keep up with it all. But it wasn't until Eyes Wide Shut that I really felt as if he had become untethered from the zeitgeist. You know, he still more or less still gets it in
that
Full
movie's
Metal
got
Jacket.
so much going on too. That's another thing. It's like,
Well, it's hard when you know the way he lived like a hermit just in his castle in England, and it's like as much of and at the same time it's like as much of a research hound as he was, it's very strange that he wouldn't keep up. Like he would seem to be the type of person that would get 10 papers from different publications and read them all cover to cover.
Which is what Joyce did too. That's the reason I said Joyce literally, his brother, he would have his brother would be taking care of him and would bring him he wanted every book that was written that year, and he was going to read them. And Kubrick was the same exact way.
He was pretty exhaustive with his research. Of course, trying to figure out what the motivating factor is with everything is a little bit tough with Kubrick, because then he says dismissive stuff after doing all of this real life research. He goes, oh yeah, real is interesting. Or no, he goes, real is good, interesting is better. So I don't know take that as you
But
will.
you have to know everything that's real in order to...
Yeah,
it's like I
absolutely.
feel like he just wanted to know all this stuff so he didn't even have to. It's informed by. He's informed by it, even if he doesn't use it.
Sure, so he can do his incredibly savvy take on reality,
Right.
of course. Well, somebody stayed at the Stanley Hotel. My roommate stayed at the Stanley Hotel. She said it was not as scary as the first 10 minutes of The Shining, that she had to leave the room.
Right. Yeah, my parents didn't stay there, but they went by there and got a postcard and sent it to me and was like, yeah, we were at the Stanley. But yeah, Kubrick as a whole, just to separate from The Shining just for a minute, I feel like there's for people who love Kubrick, I almost feel like you kind of grow up with him. And I know we talked about this before, but it's like when you're young, The Shining and Full Metal Jacket are probably the two most commercial movies that you will see when you're young, because it's in the air. People who love war movies, like my father or my brother, would watch Full Metal Jacket, and for kids who want to do something naughty and watch a horror movie, The Shining is one of them.
They're on tape.
Yeah.
You can find them.
And then you graduate a little bit, and you see, when you're young and you're full of piss and vinegar, you like Dr. Strangelove, you like A Clockwork Orange because they're punk rock and they're cool and they go against the system. And then you graduate a little bit more in college and you see 2001 and you're like, 2001 is where it's at. That is cinematic art where no other cinematic art is. But then you settle into your middle age and you're like, you know what? Barry Lyndon is his best movie.
I completely agree with you. And before I had seen Barry Lyndon, Paths of Glory was my favorite.
Yep.
Something about it. It had a specific vision. There was something like Wells about it, like Fritz Lang, something bigger than life that was just going on. But then Barry Lyndon is like a perfect film for me. There's something about it that is just, I don't know. It's all there.
And it's
Everything
something that
you
clicks
want.
because certainly, like when I was in high school or college, it's like, I don't want to watch a 3-hour costume drama type of thing.
I avoided
nothing
it
about
for
this
years.
connects with me. I couldn't get past like the first half hour, and then something about the past year or two, when I finally sat down and watched it, was like, oh my god, like I can't believe I missed all of this.
Well, I think the comedy in Full Metal Jacket is pretty hard to miss. The comedy in The Shining is there, and when you see it enough times, you definitely get to enjoy it. The comedy in Barry Lyndon is very oddly submerged and has to be. Barry Lyndon is the ultimate "you come to me" movie, you might say, and you really have to kind of get tuned into what it's doing in order to find all that Lord Bullingdon stuff and all that stuff hilarious. But it is hilarious and on purpose. I hate to fall back on what the squares say about Kubrick, because the squares always tried to clean up Kubrick more than he ever deserved to be cleaned up. But somebody said he was basically a shy Jewish kid who looked on the world of the Gentiles with a kind of like equal amounts fascination and kind of dismissal. Like there's no such thing as a hero in a Kubrick film with which he's perfectly aligned, and that has to do with his apprehension about life itself. He's somebody
And
who
humanity too.
Yeah, he's somebody who respects you too much to basically say it's all good.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting reading his, there's certainly, we got that documentary about Kubrick that Jan Harlan did, and there's all these interviews with filmmakers who had communication with him, and, all of them say like he was very generous with his time and with his reverence of each other's work, but that there was a point where it's like, you can't get that far with him. You can't get too much inside. Steven Spielberg would tell a story where I think it was when he was trying to pitch him on AI, and it's like, the fax machine would light up at 3 o'clock in the morning with like ideas, and he would expect a response, because if he didn't get a response within a minute's time, a phone call would happen. And Steven Spielberg's sitting there with his wife, and his wife is like, you got to get that thing out of here, or you got to, go sleep somewhere else, because I'm not doing this. And it's just, it's like not being understanding of someone else's time, but also just being so wrapped up in your art and your work that it's like, why aren't you as excited as I am? Why aren't you given as much time as I am?
Personally.
Yeah.
And it can be tough for some people if they're not quite like that as people, as artistic people. But I mean, that's why his films are what they are. Tarkovsky was similar. A lot of those directors, they were very specific about what they wanted, and they thought you were going to be as serious as they were. Like, why aren't you?
Absolutely. Ridley Scott talks about it being a gig, and we all love Ridley Scott's films, but clearly there are those like Kubrick and Tarkovsky for whom this is an animating force in their lives.
Yeah.
This is their reason for being. Man. I mean, you can see it in every fiber of their work, even the lesser ones, right? You look at, it's like Stalker to me is, I don't know, Solaris and Stalker to me are like my least favorite, but then it's like they're better than some people's best films. So it's like, it's really that type of thing with Kubrick as well, maybe lesser so because he took his time getting there, whereas Tarkovsky, it just felt was like right off the bat kind of, but I mean, very different artists, but similar in their work ethic.
Yeah.
Specificity, I feel like.
When everybody tries to track a great director's work along,
Right.
you try and like break it up into two groups of films. Like these are like the whatever films, but these are the real films or whatever. And I don't try and be dismissive of any of them because they're all great films. Blah blah blah. You might say that there are fairly neatly categorized already films that were trying to break ground and actually expand the dimensions of whatever narrative they were working in or genre they were working in. Like 2001: A Space Odyssey was a new kind of movie. Clockwork Orange, to a certain extent, was a new kind of movie. Lolita, for its time, was a very new kind of movie. And these films have mixed success because in trying to hammer out new borders, it messes up the frame. And then other movies like Barry Lyndon, which is a pretty straight costume drama, Shining, which is a pretty straight horror movie, Full Metal Jacket, which is a very specific kind of, it was the boot camp movie, which was a thing in the post-war years. It's a pretty straight boot camp to combat movie. These films that exist in these already neatly pre-framed genres are, and that's why I call it the only, maybe his most perfect films, because all the parts are there and they all line up nice and there's nothing that is really outlying or whatever.
Right.
But they're not my favorite Kubrick films because for me, we need to gesture beyond the boundaries of even his own imagination. He's challenging us to come up with a better way to see humanity than his.
Well, it's like Lynch with Straight Story. You know, it's like this sort of thing where it's like, you know, you kind of make a career on taking certain risks and not giving away all the pieces, and then it's like it's really cool to see them work in a world of maybe more things making sense, but still there's that stamp of their artistry on it.
That's why Aronofsky's The Wrestler is such a perfect little film, because he's not trying to screw around too much for once, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
I did want to mention a very big piece of the acting puzzle for The Shining for me was Scatman Crothers. I just really love his contribution to this film. I think it's one of those things where he plays with our expectations a little bit, Kubrick does, because it's like, could this guy be the savior? And it's like, yeah, I just felt like his interpretation of the dialogue was very, I just like him as an actor already, but
it's the scariest moment in the movie for me, even though it's not scary in any conventional way. It's not the murder scene of poor Scatman Crothers, but it's actually the time when he turns to Danny and telepathically says, "How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?" or whatever. That scared the hell out of me.
That's the one that scared me when I was 17 watching it for the first time. I was like, I got chills.
That's scary.
Yeah. Oh man.
It holds up. It'll continue to hold up. I shudder to think what people are going to be seeing in it in 20 years.
It does seem like with each passing year, like, you know, every year Halloween comes and it's one of those movies that I have to watch within the month, that Robin and I have to watch within the month, and each year it does feel like it grows a little bit more, it gets a little bit deeper, you notice a lot more things. Like now I'm going to have to watch the Shelley Duvall reflection things. God knows I didn't see that. But you notice more things, and it just seems to be one of those films that kind of rises up a little bit in the list. If people make like, you know, top 5, top 3 horror films, it seems to be in there a little bit more each year.
And like a great album where you'll obsessively listen to the same 5 songs, and then those songs get old and you have to find new great songs on the same album, the scenes that you remember maybe early on kind of fall into their place, and then you start noticing other scenes that are really great. Like the whole elevators splashing out blood thing never really worked on me. Now I think it's the best part of the movie. It's what he does. He needs to find a crystalline image to express what he's doing with this movie.
And he always finds the right camera movement in the right way. And it's, you know, there's one example in here and there's one example in Barry Lyndon. In Barry Lyndon, you think, you know, oh, every frame is a painting. But then when they do the fight, he's handheld and getting behind them, and he's not afraid to do that. With this, when he's doing the axe, every time it's like he moves the camera with the axe, and it's like, you know, jolt, 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 jolt. He's not afraid to do those types of things. It doesn't have to be completely perfect. He can move the image. He can be jarring. It's, you know, he always finds the right way to photograph something.
Well, and you know, the cinematic language he uses is so potent in this that's what allowed Spielberg to do what he did in Ready Player One with that homage, because I felt like and he wanted to play in that universe, and he understood it so well from studying it that it's like, oh, wouldn't this be cool if this character hasn't seen the movie, so they don't know this blood's about to pour out of this elevator. Like and I know people have conflicting ideas about that movie and book, but it's like, it really was cool as a fan of The Shining to see Spielberg play in that world a little bit. I
haven't seen Ready Player One, I must admit, so I'm ruined for that, but I'll be ready
I'm
for
sorry,
it.
didn't mean to spoil that for you. But
the great teacher Frank Manchel says, nobody cares about what happens in the movie. They pay their $10 because they want to see how it happens. So I felt really great every time I've spoiled a movie for somebody. I just fall back on good old Frank Manchel.
All right.
And Danny Lloyd, the real,
Yeah.
grew up to be a perfectly well-adjusted person.
That's great.
I think he had the time of his life. I don't think he was, I think, I certainly don't, there's no footage of Kubrick being mentally abusing to him. Hopefully not. But I just think he was just like, I'm in a playground, ride a bike,
Right?
all around this this empty hotel. Sure.
People still talk about that scene covetously.
Thank you so much for being here.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you very much, man.
Gentlemen.
All right, we did The Shining. This was great. All right, October month continues. So next week we're going to be doing The Innocents, one of my favorite Halloween movies, one of my favorite movies to watch during Halloween, one of my favorite haunted house movies. I love it. Devon's not as familiar with it, but I'm going to get him acquainted.
But I like Turn of the Screw.
Yes.
As a novel, so it's gonna. I've never seen it, so I'm excited to watch it.
Oh, I didn't know you had it.
Yeah, I had. I never
perfect.
did. So it's in the mail from good old Netflix, and I'll
You guys are both over my heads. I need to do some serious homework.
And then we'll wrap up the month with a compare and contrast of Howard Hawks' is The Thing and
Which I've never
John
seen.
Carpenter's
Oh,
The Thing.
that has been needed to be done for so long.
So long.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. Happy October.